Here's an oxymoron for you. A good villain. Ever heard that one before? Yes. Today we're talking about what makes a good villain or antagonist. And before we start, I want to make something very clear. Antagonists are not the same as villains. An antagonist can be a villain, but that's not always the case. And we'll look at a few examples of both. Welcome back to the Raven's Writing Room. Let's get right into it. We're continuing our discussion on characters, and now I want to talk about character roles. And the antagonist is one role that I really want to touch on because I think that villains and antagonists are confusing to many writers. Firstly, let's get a misconception out of the way. An antagonist is not necessarily a villain. A villain is someone who is always opposed to or seeking the destruction of the protagonist or what they protect. They are acting morally wrong, they are acting evil, they are acting destructive. An antagonist is simply an obstacle or someone who works in contrast to the protagonist. So, a good example, there's no question that Voldemort is the villain in Harry Potter. He wants to destroy Harry and rewrite the wizarding world. Pretty obvious villain. But what about the Dursleys? Are they villains too? No, the Dursleys aren't out to kill Harry, nor are they out to damage his world. They are the temporary antagonists who just want to live in their blissful ignorance and muggle way of life, and they feel like Harry is sabotaging it, so they like to make his life more difficult as a result. They aren't evil or seeking the destruction of the protagonist. They just don't actively seek to destroy him. They just don't like him or what he represents. So I want you to understand that difference because it's going to come into play later. Now that we know what villains and antagonists are, how do we write them and recognize them? Well, the first thing we have to understand about the antagonists is that they are characters. Odd, right? But I'm not joking. Remember what I said it takes to make a good character? Goals, desires, flaws, interests, conviction. These are all necessary for the antagonist or villain as well. If all you want is just an evil obstacle for your protagonist to overcome, that's fine, as long as you're aware that it's just a monster. St. George overcoming the dragon is a fine story on its own, but the dragon has no character. It's just a big obstacle to defeat. A villain? Yeah, sure, it's a villain, but a dynamic and engaging one? No. Not without further context, at least. Evil done for evil's sake is the standard quite often. There's something refreshing, though, about a villain who just straight up will acknowledge, yeah, I'm evil. Step off or get crushed. I remember the good old days of like Dick Dastardly or Dr. Evil and other great villains who did what they did for no other reason than it's fun to be the bad guy. You gotta love a villain who can just straight up say that.
See, I find this business rather fun. I don't want your assistance or your adulation. I'll vaporize your galaxy and bid ya bye-bye. Why? Come on, guess!
'Cause you're the bad guy?
Or, well, girl.
As Tim Curry, one of the famous villain actors in the 90s media, said in an interview, quote, I like risky roles, abrasive characters that the audience won't necessarily like, end quote. Sometimes it can be fun to be the antagonist. They get to break the rules, live on the wild side, mess up other people's day. Villains and antagonists have the opportunity to control the plot even if they don't control the outcome. And that's kind of liberating to know that every character is reacting to your actions rather than the other way around. But even when creating evil characters, they still must be bound by the rules of characterization. Consider for a moment another famous Tim Curry line, quote, that's why I want to be an actor. I don't want to play endless variations of just one character, end quote. If all villains are just evil for evil's sake, there's no intrigue. That's why I have variations of villainy and antagonism. That's right, these are the 5 different categories of villainy and how to write them. Please note that there are other categories and subcategories within these, but these are just the most common in media that I've noticed. Let's get into it. Number 1, the natural foe. The natural foe is often just an antagonist more than a villain. Natural foes are antagonists who are antagonistic by their very nature. Tom and Jerry are a cat and a mouse. Tom is usually the antagonist, but we can't blame Tom for it. That's what a cat does, eat mice. In Land Before Time, the dinosaur hatchlings were constantly on the run from Sharptooth. While the Sharptooth is a dangerous threat, you can't blame the beast for its behavior. It's doing what it's naturally inclined to do. Natural foes are usually seen in movies or shows involving animal characters, because the animal protagonist is often the prey and will have an antagonist or villain who is their natural foe or predator. In American Tail, it was mice versus cats. In Finding Nemo, it was fish versus sharks, anglerfish, human fishermen, and other such things. Now, the natural foe can manifest itself as a villain sometimes, such as in the movie Ferngully, where the villain is literally a spirit of pollution called Hexus, or Once Upon a Forest, where a gas leak kills off a lot of animals, or in Bambi, when a forest fire nearly destroys the woods. I'll get more into the man is evil trope in the next category, but I mention it here because these are indirect but natural antagonists to the protagonist. The ignorant man or the living embodiment of pollution are natural foes to nature and animals, so they can be mentioned here. Now, the best way to write a natural foe antagonist is not to dive too deep into the moral. This kind of antagonist doesn't deal in morals. Morals just natural order. Tom and Jerry never question the moral right and wrong of their feud, only the natural truth that cats and mice are enemies. You can have the antagonist do morally bad things, but if you do it too frequently or with too much regularity, then you fade out of the natural foe and go into other categories. An example from myself, I wrote a short story once called Snake and a Mouse, where a mouse is on the run from an owl and hides in a log for shelter, only to find it's owned by a venomous snake. Now, the snake acts like an antagonist at first to the mouse until the owl attack, which leads to the snake and the owl fighting. When the snake finally kills the owl, it's revealed that the snake has actually been quite lonely as no one comes to visit it out of fear. The snake is no longer the antagonist. The owl is. Now, the funny thing is the owl has no lines. The owl doesn't do anything morally wrong other than try to eat the snake and the mouse. The owl isn't being evil, nor is the snake, nor is the mouse. All are natural creatures behaving as nature intended. It's that simple. That's natural foe. Number 2, the materialistic. There's an old saying that money is the root of all evil, and I'd argue that's not true, but for some villains it is. There was a common theme in the 80s and 90s where you had villains who were just money hungry, greedy bastards who cared so much about making money they did whatever was necessary, even at the detriment of others. The benefit of writing villains like this is that their motivation is painfully easy to understand and write. The negative is that it can also be painfully weak. For example, take Clayton from Tarzan. He wants to capture the gorillas, sell them to zoos, and make money, but he was already making a lot of money with the research team. Why throw that away? How ironic that in a lot of these stories, it's often the filthy rich characters already who are the villains out for more money. Oh, hi, when did you get here? And this leads into what I was saying earlier about the man as bad villainy. In a lot of nature movies, man is portrayed as ignorant and evil because they care more about money than they do about nature. Who cares about the poor innocent animals when you can chop down a whole rainforest and make money and profit? This would be a fine villain, except there's nothing dynamic here. There's nothing to gravitate us toward them or make us understand their position. To write this character better, try establishing more motivation than just I like money. Maybe give them a reason they want money, outside of just greed. Maybe go the route of a character like Kasim and Magi, the Labyrinth of Magic. Kasim grew up penniless and with a drunk, abusive father. He lost his sister to disease, and then he watches his friend from childhood grow up to become a prince and a ruler, and he was enraged at the injustice of it all. He craved power, he craved wealth, he craved position. All of these materialistic things he wanted because of how cheated he felt. He's still materialistic, but he also is more dynamic now. Someone we actually want to feel pity for and even understand why they are acting the way they are. If you give the villain a reason or conviction, it makes them more engaging. Number 3, the idealist. These villains are probably the most common nowadays. Apollyon, the Major, Thanos, Light, Pain. In fact, this brand of villain is so common, the anime One Punch Man has a running joke about villains explaining their ideology and backstory to Saitama so long and so stupidly, Saitama often punches them midway through their rant. But part of the reason it's so common is because it's easily one of the best. Villains with ideals that drive their villainy are some of the most interesting. Apollyon's ideology is that war is the natural state of humanity, and thus she will incite war. Light believes that the world is corrupt and full of sin, and since no one is willing to do anything about them, he must take matters into his own hands and become the god of justice the world needs. Heath Ledger's Joker believes that all of man is corrupt inside to the core, and is out to prove that any man can become a villain if pushed in the right way.
You and I are both seeking the very same thing. We both want to achieve the peace that Jiraiya Sensei envisioned. You and I are the same, We're both motivated by our desire for peace and justice. The justice that I have delivered against the Leaf Village is no different from what you are trying to do to me. Everyone feels the same pain when losing something dear. You and I have both experienced that pain. You strive for your justice, and I strive for mine. We're both just ordinary men who have been driven to seek vengeance in the name of justice. And if one comes to call vengeance justice, such justice will only breed further vengeance and trigger a vicious cycle of hatred. Right now, we live in such a cycle. I know the past and can foretell our future. It is the same as our history. So we believe that human beings simply cannot understand each other, and they never will.
I'm not saying you have to like them, I'm saying they can challenge your understanding. The downside to this kind of villain, though, is if the ideology and the villain start working against each other. Let's say you have a villain who's a nihilist who believes nothing matters. The law doesn't matter, life doesn't matter, mankind should live however they see fit because at the end of the day, it's all a waste. We're going to die someday, so why bother worrying about consequences? Okay, fine character, fine villain, but then this same guy runs away from the cops or authority figures whenever they show up, starts crying victimhood about how no one understands him and everyone else is too dumb to get him, avoids death and consequences if he can become a parent because he apparently his life and well-being does matter for some reason, begs for mercy and or help from higher powers when in tough situations, and will try to give off an air of superiority like he somehow cracked the code of the universe by realizing that there is nothing to realize or care about. Oh wait, am I getting too on the nose here? There is no easy way to write this villain. The best way, in my opinion, is to analyze a certain ideology like nihilism, Machiavellianism, communism, and create a character who drags it to an extreme. Legend of Korra admittedly did this well with characters like Zahir and Aman. Number 4, the vengeful. Revenge is a very basic and understandable motivator. Someone wronged you, and thus you must repay them in kind. This kind of villain works because in the most basic sense, they are fulfilling justice in their own way. An eye for an eye, after all. What makes them villains is that the hero's moral code stands in opposition of seeking justice through blood. The villain often ends up destroying the world or others around them in the name of vengeance. Jason Todd, Sasuke Uchiha, Ryoga Hibiki, and others all act in the name of getting even or getting what they desire. This villain is easy to write for the most part because we all know what it's like to be cheated and can understand a character's desire to want things their way or to at least take down the person who wronged them. Even some heroes in popular anime are becoming very vengeful characters, such as in Redo of a Healer or Rising of the Shield Hero. They're characters who were greatly wronged and are now seeking revenge, thus making them question the line between what is evil and what is good. In fact, after watching just a few episodes of Redo of Healer, I'm convinced he's a villain. However, the trick to writing this character is how they go about their revenge. Ryoga, for example, spends the first several episodes of his appearance claiming he wants to fight Ranma out of need for revenge, but once it's revealed why he wants revenge, Ryoga suddenly falls in love with Akane Tendo and finds a new direction and desire for himself, thus taking away the necessity of his motivation. A better example would be Sasuke, a character so driven by their revenge and need for it that they literally start hurting their own allies to get it. They lose sight of the world around them and the good in it because they only see the person they want to get back at. That's an example of a decent vengeful character. Although I argue that Sasuke is also a pretty stupid character, but that's another video. Finally, the demon. Of all the villain types, this is the kind that is most chilling. The demon is a villain who feels no empathy. They have no relatability. They are not sympathetic. You cannot rationalize what they do or why they do it, and their motives seem driven beyond understanding or rational thought. They are pure evil and feel like the rules of morality do not apply to them. The Joker, Darkseid, Frieza, Emperor Palpatine, and of course Lucifer himself all share this classification. Their evil is limitless. Their motives seem little more than to simply destroy everything around them. If they do have a motive, it's simply to show the world how more powerful they are than everyone else, to cement their superiority and to crush all that would defy them. You don't see these kind of villains as often anymore, and for a pretty good reason. Writing them well is difficult. You'd think it'd be very easy, just write a character with no morality, but that's harder than you'd think. It's not just about the morality. To write these characters effectively, two other ingredients are needed: ego, and conviction. More often than not, these villains are still out to accomplish something within their story, and they will always feel firmly about completing it. Not only this, but they will often be haughtily arrogant. Those who see morality as beneath them see no reason to stand on the level of lesser beings. Everyone else is their inferior. Darkseid and Frieza particularly portray this. In fact, Frieza is an interesting case as he looks on others as inferior to him, but still acts with a refined politeness that's off-putting. He has class, and that's often how one might see these villains. Someone who is above morality, but still acts like he should be a sophisticate. I too created such a villain in my story, The Tale of Tomoki, a demon lord named Boalak, who was revived in the final act of the story. This beast was supremely powerful and believed humanity was put on Earth to serve at his whim. When Tomoki comes to fight him, Boalak not only dispatches him easily in their first fight, he claims that during the fight, he had been busy reading Tomoki's mind while fighting, so even while kicking Tomoki around like a rag doll, he'd been distracted, still not fighting at his absolute best, meaning he was holding back the whole time. A crushing blow to Tomoki and a bolster to Boalak's own ego. So with all these villain types explained now, let's wrap up. In conclusion, villains and antagonists don't have to be the same thing. Start by understanding what your villain is seeking to accomplish and how he will go about achieving it. Consider whether or not you want your villain to be sympathetic or not. There's no shame in making him non-relatable. As said before, there are plenty of examples of good villains who we don't relate to. And recognize the traits that make a villain and the different classifications. Know these roles and stereotypes because they can set up the framework of your villain. As a little test for yourself, here's your challenge. I told you, I'm going to try to end each of these writing rooms with a little challenge for you. In the comments section, create a villain or antagonist for a new For Honor campaign. Because everyone's been asking me, hey man, if you could rewrite For Honor somehow, how would you do it? Pretend that there's a new For Honor campaign. They've made a new campaign story. Create a villain or antagonist for it. If you don't know much about For Honor, it can be for another game or media. Just let me know what it is. You know, like it can be DC, Marvel, whatever. But you got to let me know. Describe which of the categories this villain falls into. Tell me what their goal is and what they strive to do and how they will go about it. Explain also how you came up with this villain. And I'll give a shout out to the best villain in my next Raven updates. All right, guys, I think that wraps things up. Thank you so much for watching today. Please leave the comment with your created villain, or just leave a comment to say what you thought about what I had to say. Give a shout out to your own favorite villains and your favorite medias, and tell me which category you think they fall into, or if you think they have their own category, and that'd be a fun discussion. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.